So last week we celebrated Easter and all of the beauty and excitement that comes with celebrating Easter. And today we kind of pick up from that story. Jesus had risen. The miraculous had happened. Any doubts the disciples had had about who they'd been following must have been dispelled when they met the risen Lord, saw him walking, talking, eating in their presence. On multiple occasions, Jesus made appearances to Mary at the tomb, to Cleopas and another disciple on the road to Emmaus, to some of the disciples hiding in a locked room for fear of the authorities, to Thomas, where the doubting disciple was invited to place his fingers into the wounds on Jesus' hands and side. And Jesus appeared to the 7 of his disciples at the Sea of Galilee. The 7 had gone out fishing in their boat, having returned to their old profession for lack of any significant direction in their lives. And as they cast the nets over the side, they notice someone on the shore, but they can't quite make out who it is. A voice calls out, "Friends, have you caught any fish?" "No," they reply, "nothing yet," painfully reminded of a time a few short years ago when their Lord had called them into service in just such a setting. The voice on the shore invites them to cast their net on the right side of the boat, and as they throw them over, the nets are flooded with fish. The disciples look at one another, a sense of déjà vu washing over them, and John knows instantly, it is Jesus. "It is the Lord," he proclaims, and suddenly Peter's out of the boat swimming to shore, his breath coming in spurts and starts as he throws his arms around his friend, his leader, his Lord. When the nets have been hauled in and the boat finally makes it to shore, Jesus is waiting for them. "Come, have some breakfast with me. Bring some of the fish you just caught, and we will eat." Wow. Just like old times, the simple act of sharing breakfast with a group of friends, such a normal thing to do, and yet with a man resurrected from the dead, not so normal, extraordinary, really. How could they even begin to press us all that has transpired in the past few days? As the fish fries on the charcoal embers and the disciples pelt Jesus with questions of what happened when he died, where he went, what happens next, what they should do, Jesus surveys the ragtag group he called to be his disciples, and his heart goes out to these men who really do not understand that they are part of something so much bigger than themselves and what they are about to experience. After breakfast, Jesus turns to Peter and begins to question him. Reading from John 21, 15 through 19. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied, "you know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to him to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." Peter had spent the last few years of his life following Jesus around the countryside. learning from him, questioning him, sticking his foot in his mouth, boasting of his love for Jesus, and most recently, denying him, denying that he knew Jesus as the guards carried him away to be crucified. And now Jesus challenges Peter to carry out a new commission. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? More than these what? More than these disciples love me? More than you love the other disciples? More than you love the things around you in your life, the boat, the fishing, the promise of a normal life? We don't know for sure what these meant, but the commentaries seem to agree that due to Peter's boasting of his love for Jesus Christ and then failing to be even associated with Jesus at the time of his trial, it's likely Jesus meant, do you love me more than the other disciples love me? Peter had boasted of his love for Jesus above all the other disciples in other settings. In Matthew 26:33 and Mark 14:29, Peter declares, even if no one else deserts you, I will never desert you. In John 13:37, he asserts, I'm ready to die for you. And yet he was the one to publicly deny Jesus in the moment of crisis. And so Jesus asked Peter about his commitment to him. And of course, Peter responds, yes, Lord, you know I love you. But then Jesus asks again and again, almost as though he doesn't really believe Peter. Or is he trying to get at something deeper? Jesus certainly knows Peter is attached to him. It is quite obvious in all of Peter's exuberance at seeing Jesus. Peter is the disciple with whom Jesus doesn't have to guess. He's the one who wears his emotions on his face, on his sleeve for all to see. But why ask 3 times? Seems a little redundant, doesn't it? Andres J. Kostenberger notes in the Baker Exegetical Commentary, Jesus' threefold repetition of his question may reflect the Near Eastern custom of reiterating a matter 3 times before witnesses in order to convey a solemn obligation, especially with regard to contracts or conferring rights or legal dispositions. And by analogy, Jesus' threefold question lends solemnity to his commissioning. So the repeat question could be based on cultural norms and Jesus' desire to bring formality to the conversation, especially considering how the conversation ends with Jesus telling Peter of how he will die for the glory of God. And of course, Peter is disappointed that Jesus asked the question 3 times. Doesn't he know how much I love him? Perhaps Peter finally realizes he can't prove to Jesus his love. Rather, he's trying to give them, and rather than trying to give him a long list of all the ways he loves him, he says, Lord, you know all things. You know my heart. Maybe Peter has finally learned he can't follow Jesus in his own strength and has realized the futility of offering his loyalty in a way that relies more on his own willpower than on Jesus' enablement. But not only does Jesus ask Peter about loyalty to him, he also commands him 3 times to feed his sheep. And this isn't the first time we've encountered the reference to shepherding a flock or tending to sheep. Jesus himself is known as the Good Shepherd, and in this role willingly laid down his life for his sheep. And the pairing of, do you love me and feed my sheep, is a reminder of Jesus' words in John 13:34 and 35. So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. In Peter's commissioning, Jesus is calling Peter to love his sheep as he has loved them, and the love he has for the sheep will be the evidence of his love for Jesus. Now, when we come to verses 18 and 19, Jesus introduces a new teaching, and a very hard one at that, and it's couched in a short parable. Verses 18 and 19, it says, "I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Now, in the ancient world, the expression to stretch out hands was widely taken to refer to crucifixion. The stretching occurred when a condemned man was tied to the horizontal crossbar and compelled to carry his cross to the place of execution. If you've ever watched The Passion of the Christ, you will no doubt remember the horrible scene where Jesus is nailed to the crossbar and forced to carry it through the streets. In Jesus' conversation with Peter, he is not only telling him one day he will die a martyr, but that he will die by crucifixion, just the same as Jesus did. And by the time John writes his gospel, Jesus' prediction has been fulfilled. According to Clement, one of the early church fathers, Peter suffered martyrdom under Nero sometime between 54 and 68 AD. And then in 212 AD, Tertullian, another early church father from the Roman province of Africa, asserted that Peter died by crucifixion. How the words of Jesus must have washed over Peter. The rest of his life would have to be lived in the shadow of the cross, just like Jesus. What I most want to draw your attention to is the question itself that Jesus asks. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Not, "Simon, will you take care of the church once I have gone?" "Simon, will you love the other disciples and support them in their ministries?" Not, "Simon, will you give to the poor as much as you can and care for the defenseless?" Nor, "Simon, will you build a big church so all will come and worship together in Jerusalem?" No. The question is about Peter's love for Jesus. Is it not a true picture of the gospel that Jesus' singular question to him is about love, specifically the supreme love for Jesus himself? It seems to be a paradox that the one who loves Jesus supremely will love others more, not less. The goal of the Christian life is not to love our family and our friends and our community, but to love Jesus more than all. And mysteriously, in so doing, we will love others more. And this call is not just to pastors and priests, church leaders. It is for all to love Jesus. And in our love for Jesus, we will find fulfillment and peace that squashes our fears, builds our confidence, and brings perspective to our lives. In loving Jesus, we will feel so loved that it will pour out of us into those around us. In loving Jesus, we will feel so loved that it will pour out of us into those around us. The New Interpreter's Bible Commentary notes that Jesus commissions to Peter in this story both to feed his sheep and to follow him are grounded in and derive from Peter's love of Jesus. It is in the post-resurrection community's love for Jesus that he continues to be fully known. And we are part of that post-resurrection community. To love Jesus is to know Jesus, because as Jesus' words make clear, to love Jesus is to shape one's life according to Jesus' life. Peter's love of Jesus will be evidenced when he cares for Jesus' sheep, not apart from that. And so Peter is called to the cross. The act of love that is required of Peter is an act of love that matches Jesus' own love. And Peter models for the faith community the ultimate fidelity to Jesus' words because he fulfills Jesus' core command that his disciples love one another as he has loved them. But what does this act of love mean for the post-resurrection community? If Peter's act of love is the model, if a life that embraces martyrdom fills Jesus' commands to his followers, what about those believers who don't lay down their lives in love, who are not martyred? Are they excluded from the circle of Jesus' love? This question was hotly debated in the first century. Martyrdom was a real and present possibility for many within the community. Did those who died for their faith love Jesus more? Were they more loved by Jesus? Although Jesus calls his disciples to a life shaped by love that mirrors his own is undeniable, not all discipleship is marked by the disciple laying down his or her life. Whew, good news. We know this because John himself, known as the disciple whom Jesus loved, did not die a martyr's death. And it's easy for us in our 21st century mindset, born to freedom of speech and religion, to brush off this discussion of martyrdom as irrelevant to our personal reality. But it's not irrelevant to everyone living in the 21st century. Many Christian disciples today give their lives for others in love. Priests and nuns who have stayed in their ministries in Africa and South America, knowing it will cost them their lives. Nurses, doctors, aid workers in hospitals and healthcare facilities in impoverished and war-torn countries around the world. We cannot, as Christians, forget that type of discipleship still exists in the 21st century. So how do our small forms of discipleship stand up against people willing to lay down their lives for strangers, people whose names they may never know as they help and tend them? It's easy to become disheartened and minimize the worth of our witness when compared to the sacrifice of these. And yet Jesus doesn't compare. He gives his gifts of love and grace to all his disciples. He grants life to those who give up their lives in love and those who struggle in what may seem the smallest place to show Jesus' love. The call from Jesus is not to a specific action, but to a state of the heart. Your lot may be martyrdom, but it may not be. We are all called to different ministries and different forms of suffering. It's not our right to judge others by their calling, nor should we compare ours to others. At the end of our passage, just as Jesus has told Peter he will die a martyr, the story continues on with Peter questioning Jesus about the other disciples, as, of course, Peter would do. What about John, Lord? Does he die a martyr too? Verses 20 and 22 read, Peter turned around and saw behind them the disciple Jesus loved, the one who had leaned over to Jesus during supper and asked, Lord, who will betray you? Peter asked Jesus, What about him, Lord? And Jesus replied, If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As for you, follow me. Mind your own business. We are not to judge others by their gifts, nor should we presume that we are called to do what others are called to do. Feeding the sheep was Peter's job. Dying by crucifixion was Peter's burden to carry, but it wasn't every disciple's burden. The church often gets caught up in the sensationalism of certain gifts and ministries, placing elevated importance on them because they are more visible. We tend to celebrate certain ministries such as the charismatic speaker, the musician, the healer, but we miss the administrator, the helper, the prayer warrior, which are all powerful giftings and often overlooked. Paul picks up on this with his illustration of the body in a number of his epistles. His message is, don't try to be someone you are not. Embrace who you are and know that your role has value in God's eyes. You will glorify God by embracing your gift and your role. And as we close today, above all, I invite you to remember our measure of spirituality is always our love for Jesus, demonstrated through our love for one another. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Love is always the calling of every believer. By our love, they will know we are Christians. Amen. Let us bow our head and pray. Father, you are the one who has given us the gifts that we have. You know our lot in life, what trials we face, what struggles we seek to overcome. And just like you did with Peter on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, so many years ago, you come to us today and you ask us, my precious disciple, do you love me? And we reply, yes, Father, we do. May this be our heart's cry each day. Jesus, I love you. May our love for you be seen in all that we do and all that we say. Amen.